Good Friday morning to you. I'm T.Y. Chang from TYT Investigates, climate change investigative reporter. And I published an article this week. I hope everybody will go look at it, TYT Investigates. Basically, it's entitled A Rare Green Victory. That is something for this week. I had talked about it on Wednesday. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more today as well, because today I said it's a green victory, perhaps. In the long run, it's a perhaps. It's still going to be a perhaps there. So I am now trying to see if I can get this to come up, and so I can look at the chats a little bit later. But what I it's on TYT, my latest article, a rare green victory on Capitol Hill. Sort of interesting that when you don't have a villain, it seems like people don't want to read about it as much. They want to have a, a bad guy in there. Whenever I have some villains, it seems like there's a lot more people reading than when you say some positive things. But this is a positive thing for the Democrats finally have a bill on Wednesday night or Wednesday afternoon. The House passed 233 to 188, the Moving Forward Act. Pretty much all Democrats voting for the bill and all Republicans voting against it in the House. It's a $1.5 trillion infrastructure funding bill. It's not an actual green stimulus bill, but it has a lot of green in it, significant green portions on climate change, such as supporting public transit, which would impact the MTA in New York City and the subways and the buses there. And it would require that 75%, this is a bill that's passed the House, still has to go to the Senate, which is not going to happen. And it still have to be signed by the president, which is not going to happen. And then it would become law. So it's not law yet, but it did at least pass the House. 75% of US Postal Service vehicles will be electric if this bill were to become law. And the really important part about this is because, I don't know if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, I wrote about why is there no green stimulus bill? Why has there been no money for green stimulus at all? And why there's not even been a bill. So this is the first actual bill. Remember the Green New Deal, which was proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, supported by Bernie Sanders. Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts was the co-sponsor with Representative Ocasio-Cortez. That Green New Deal was just a resolution. It wasn't a bill. It's just a resolution, and it got so much flack from the Republicans and from Donald Trump. He called it baby talk. And which is ironic that Donald Trump would say anybody else has baby talk. But in any case, it is an actual bill, and that's something. So when you have a bill, people can focus on that and say, this is what we want. And then the whole week, there's a whole bunch of things that happened. So first, on Tuesday, the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis issued a 500-page plan calling for decarbonization by 2050, meaning taking all the CO2 and the methane out of the air, which is causing global warming, and supporting sustainable, non-polluting energy like wind and solar. Keep in mind that right now in the US, the more electricity is generated in the United States, 17.2%, by wind, solar, hydroelectric, wind, solar, and geothermal, in that order, mainly hydroelectric at this point. Well, that's changing. Wind is becoming really the biggest sustainable renewable energy source, because for New York State, for example, it's the number one sustainable energy source. But in the US right now, 17.2% of electricity is generated by the renewable green energy, and 17.1% is generated by coal. Just 12 years ago, I've said this a number of times, coal provided 50% of the country's electricity. So things are changing for the better, and the better for the environment, and also, interestingly enough, is actually less expensive, though that has not shown up yet. If you go to non-polluting sustainable energy sources right now, you in fact do have to pay more, like about 8% more. But at some point that should change, where it actually become cheaper. But that will only happen if a lot of the government and with industry invests trillions of dollars. Then it would go down. That's the estimate by a number of economists and scientists. So the So that was a plan. That was a big plan. And Speaker Nancy Pelosi actually was the first speaker when they publicly announced that plan in a news conference. So that's important, indicating that she's supporting it. And then that green stimulus plan was a $2 trillion. Well, no, actually, that was their plan. Actually, is a lot more. The closest I could get was more than 8 trillion. And supporting non-polluting energy like wind and solar. They covered a wide range of green stimulus solutions, like incentivizing, which means a domestic manufacturer of electric vehicles. Incentivize means basically make it like tax deductions so that companies would want to go into that because it makes it more profitable for them. Non-polluting energy like electric vehicles, and improving America's power grid and union jobs in clean energy. That's been a big part from the Green New Deal, that the best way to ensure that the you would have sustainable energy would have justice, climate justice would be if they were union jobs, well-paid union jobs, even transitioning some of the fossil fuel workers into the renewable energy sources. So that plan actually had a lot of parts from the Green New Deal. And one of the things they talked about was also climate justice, because the pandemic and COVID-19 virus have shown that there's a disproportionate damage to communities of color, because so many of the communities of color live or are situated near pollution, near industry, trash, etc. And because of that, the lungs of people who live there are more damaged. And because of that, the COVID-19, which attacks the lungs, has actually killed a greater percentage. And I know in Chicago, it was more than double the number of African Americans who, the death rate for African Americans from the coronavirus is double that for white people. So the plan has a lot of similarities to the $16 trillion Green New Deal, and that without mentioning the Green New Deal or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because they become basically lightning rods for the Republicans and Trump to attack, because she is a self-described democratic socialist. All you have to do is use that word socialist, and then a lot of America, the moderate and centrist part of America, just goes running for the hills. The irony here, though, I think I've talked about this a little before, is that in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt came up with things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and Medicare, the Republicans at that time called it socialism and attacked it as that. And today, if you were to say to people, do you believe in some socialism? A lot of Americans would say, no, I'm anti-socialist, that's communism. But then if you tell them the individual programs, like, do you believe in Social Security? They would go, oh, yeah. Do you believe in unemployment insurance? Oh, yeah. Do you believe in portions of the Affordable Care Act? Yes, but you mentioned Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and all those Fox News followers will go, oh, no, that's terrible. It's so expensive, without talking about the, 20-something million Americans who would not have health insurance if it were not for the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare. Any case, so a small number of environmental groups are unhappy about that plan a little bit. They said because it didn't include a ban on fracking and producing more fossil fuel, but the majority, it appears, of many of the environmental activist groups welcomed it. The Evergreen Action, which is the young staffers who were working for Governor Jay Inslee when he ran on a climate change platform when he ran for president before he dropped out, they formed their own group, Evergreen Action. And the Environmental Defense Fund, which has 2.5 million members, declared support for the comprehensive plan on Tuesday. In fact, read you something from the Environmental Defense Fund's Senior Vice President of Political Affairs, Elizabeth Gore. Today's vote, this is a quote, today's vote and this week's release of policy recommendations from the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis add to growing momentum to Congress to enact practical solutions that create jobs and a safer climate for our children, end quote. And then earlier on Wednesday, 60 Democratic members of the House sent a letter to Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Republican for California, requesting that Congress lead the country with a $2 trillion green stimulus plan to sustainable economic recovery with non-polluting energy and environmental justice, especially for communities of color. So we had three things this week. Most important, an actual bill, the Moving Forward Act, which I had talked about in March, how they kept saying, well, we're going to put the Moving Forward Act every month. Oh, we'll include it in the next one, include it in the next one. It was never included. I wrote about that 2 weeks ago. And then just on Wednesday, they actually passed it in the House. And the Moving Forward Act, which has a lot of green stimulus in it, was passed. And then that's number one, really important to have an actual bill that people, the Democrats and environmentalists can point to and say, this is what we want. And then you have the House Select Committee on Climate Crisis plan, the 500-page plan, very comprehensive plan with a lot of green in it, with a lot of the Green New Deal in it without actually calling it that. And then on Wednesday, there was that letter which called for the House to do even more. So you had three things going on this week. So that was good because we have to realize that, this is some momentum, forward momentum going on there. And what's interesting too is that there were a couple of polls that came out recently that talked about that the majority of Americans now, 52%, believe that dealing with climate change should be a top priority of Congress and the government. Now, to understand that and put it in perspective, just 4 years ago, a minority of the country, only 38% of the country, believed it was important. Now, 52% of the country, including majority of Republicans, well, no, I don't think that's true, actually. Top priority, no. So 52% of the country now believes that dealing with climate change should be a top priority of Congress. Only 38% a few years ago, 4 years ago, felt that way. But if you say, is climate change real and should it be addressed, not as a top priority, but just be addressed, then the overwhelming majority of Democrats, 79%, and even the majority of Republicans, 65%, agree it should be addressed. Not as a priority, but even addressed. So you have the majority, clear majority of Democrats and even Republicans saying that climate change is real and it should be addressed. Unlike what Donald Trump says, who's called it a hoax. So that's all the good part. And there was even agreement in the House on what to do in dealing with the Moving Forward Act. There was agreement that between the Republicans and the Democrats to include in that bill some basically when you have a hurricane, to deal with that kind of damage, to reinforce the seawalls, et cetera. There's agreement between both Democrats and Republicans, probably because so many of those hurricanes have hit the South more than the North. I mean, we had Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast, but the South's had Katrina and Maria in Puerto Rico, and there have been so many in Florida and Louisiana and Mississippi, so that some of the Republicans there actually came to agreement, although they didn't vote for the Moving Forward Act. They at least allowed that to be included, didn't fight it being included in the bill. But that's where they diverged. And one of the key things they diverged on was on fossil fuel. The Republicans still cling to fossil fuel, to oil and gas and fracking, and saying that this is still a good thing and we need to continue it, even though the science is saying there's only 50 years of it left. And by that time, if we continue pumping out the way we are without switching over to, for example, electric vehicles, improving the rail system so we fly less, that we face extinction, according to the majority of scientists, by 2050 if we don't lower the temperature and decarbonize the atmosphere. But obviously the huge source is from industry, although another huge source is also 25% from livestock, cattle, cows, and sheep and pigs from from ironically their farts, the methane in the gas that they release. So that was where they disagreed. And this is where what gets interesting when I'm talking about today, why in fact this is potentially uh, useless. Why I entitled it Green Victory Perhaps. It is clear that this bill that passed the House, the Moving Forward Act, which is a lot of green in it, it's an infrastructure bill talking about rebuilding roads and railroads, etc. And it's interesting that this is not going anywhere past at least not this year, and that is Mitch McConnell has said who controls what's basically the Senate Majority Leader controls what the Senate will even discuss. Remember, this bill has to pass the Senate and then be signed by the president to become law. McConnell was quoted saying after this vote, quote, "This nonsense is not going anywhere in the Senate. It will just join the list of absurd House proposals that were only drawn up to show fealty to the radical left," end quote. And then President Trump indicated that he would veto the bill. He criticized it as, quote, "full of wasteful Green New Deal initiatives." So again, they automatically go to the Green New Deal as an easy talking point that people know about. So the good thing is that it's a real bill, finally, and that it can be defended because it is genuinely about infrastructure, according to one Democratic staffer who works on. Oops, sorry about that. I hit my cord there. Let's bend this down a little bit. One Democratic staffer who works on climate change, said this is, a real bill on infrastructure. It really is about infrastructure. It's not a green stimulus bill. So even if it gets attacked, the Democrats can fight back and clearly say, no, look, it's about infrastructure. Don't you want to fix the roads? Don't you want to improve our railways, along with improving our air quality? So clearly it's not going to go to the Senate. Clearly President Trump is not going to sign into law. So, I mean, he in fact called, the climate change a hoax. That's a direct quote, one of his hoaxes. Just like he called the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, he called that a Democratic hoax, another quote. So this is a president who's anti-science, anti-intellectual, and but brilliant in mass marketing and able to convince clearly a third of the country not even to wear a mask, as if putting a mask on, is something that has become a political thing. So that's the problem that we have to deal with. The reality is that given all these things and all these positive things, that if Donald Trump is reelected president in November, and it could still happen, that all these green things will just be, as I think I put in the last line, if Donald Trump is reelected and Mitch McConnell presides over a Republican majority Senate, this week's wins become tomorrow's forgotten hopes to deal with the climate crisis. Forgotten hopes. That is what will happen if Donald Trump is reelected. If Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee, does not win, then all of this basically is of no use. Not much use. I mean, it becomes a talking point, but it will be forgotten for 4 more years because we have an anti-science, anti-intellectual, clearly anti-environment president who only cares, who seems to love oil, mainly because they've donated a lot to his campaigns, and totally pro-business. Everything is short-term business returns. And then because of that, what happens is that he's done 100, in the Trump administration, they reversed more than 100 EPA regulations. That was a count by the New York Times, 100, trying to reverse everything that they can think of that inhibits big business, no matter what it does in terms of polluting the air and the water, and basically jeopardizing the future of our children and grandchildren, and actually the future of humans on Earth. So let's see now, let's go to, I'm going to go back to the live streams, play all, and let's see if we can come up with, turn off happy July 4th. One thing that, by the way, I like to talk about with July 4th is in my lifetime, in any case, I have noticed that the people who wave the flag the most, if you ask them what it stands for, they say it stands for God and country. But then you say, well, the people who swear allegiance to the flag also swear allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. And they did a study once where they asked people, many of them flag wavers, I believe, they do you believe in freedom of speech? Do you believe in freedom of religion? Do you believe that the police cannot enter your home unless they have a warrant? Habeas corpus. Do you believe that the government does not have a right for illegal search and seizure, which is basically all the Bill of Rights from the Constitution? And the majority of them said no, they didn't. Until you said, oh, that's the Bill of Rights. Then they said yes. So they individually don't approve of the freedoms in the Constitution of the Bill of Rights. And I would ask anybody who waves the flag, have you read the US Constitution ever in your life? Do you know what it actually stands for? Do you know what it stands for? And do you know what liberty and justice for all really means? When President Barack Obama was elected president, I put 2 American flags out in my home. Now I've taken them down. Maybe I'm not as brave as to take a knee right now publicly. I haven't been. Would I do it? Probably would now. And so that's part of the environmental justice hooking up with, political and racial justice in the United States. So let's start getting to some of the. Weena Jensen is back. Did we lose? Oh no. I'm trying to get. Oh, okay, we're back. Riley Cool says, oh, I guess is really cool. Says science denialism is big business. Yes, it can be, but big business also is involved in science as well. But then they do things like charge, 100 times for medicines. While people are dying, that can happen as well. But Jennifer Doreen says, here in Ireland, there isn't enough green energy. The wind and the rain could be used. Yes, I don't know that for a fact. It's interesting that you say that because I was just reading in the New York Times this morning that off the Scottish coast, they're building these huge 500 feet tall wind turbines, and they're continuing to do that. And what they've been able to do, Weena James saying there are 2 streams at the same time, unwittingly competing against each other. Are they? Okay. So in any case, so there are, I know off the coast of Scotland, they're continuing to build, I think it's some 34 billion euros of these 500 feet tall wind turbines, even during the pandemic. They had to decide whether to continue or not, and they decided to do so. But what they did was they hooked up with the hotels that were empty along the coast, and hotels and motels and various houses, and they housed their workers and would bring them on separate buses and boats to these work sites, and they kept them isolated from other people and had 12-hour shifts. And they've not had even one case of the coronavirus among their workers. So there are ways to deal with this and continue with the necessary work. And these wind turbines, when they complete them, should be able to supply energy to 600,000 homes, which is huge. And Alicia says renewable energy and regulations are futile if capitalism still runs the USA. Okay, I'm not sure I agree with that. It's not something a lot of the young Turks like to hear. I still believe in a predominantly capitalist society with major portions of socialism. Roughly, and this is not an exact science to me, like 2/3 capitalism and 1/3 socialism. Oh, I keep hitting the cord of my microphone. But And the reason I say that is that I still believe that capitalism can be an economic engine, and that at least for this country in particular, that the majority of this country will not accept socialism, even though they accept the the parts of socialism if you don't label it, which is ironic. So then I still think that you can use capitalism as long as you have some regulations on them and you watch it carefully enough and you don't allow it to run. I think the biggest problem really is lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and the fact that you can be in Congress and be involved in government and then become a lobbyist and get lots of money. And once that's cut off, I think that would have a huge impact on regulating the government so that the government can then regulate industry. And that's where, basically, I think we see bribery, in essence, of the different politicians in Washington, D.C., although they don't call it that. There are all these dinners and trips and gifts and things like that. And I'm sure under the table, some outright cash gifts as well. So, and that's true in almost every country in the world. Um, I think it's actually less true in the United States than some other countries, but probably more so here than some others as well. But then Alicia, she's saying the only thing that will work to sustain or improve the earth is mass decline in consumption. Promoting less consumerism will never be done. The rich will suffer the most and won't let it happen. Maybe. I'm not sure that's true. Not when 52% of the country, says that, dealing with climate change should be a priority of Congress. I think things are changing a lot and faster. The pandemic, one positive part to this awful, horrible pandemic, deadly pandemic, is that people are waking up and realizing, that science doesn't care what your politics are and doesn't care whether you have a belief that science doesn't need to be followed, because it will just do what it will do regardless of whatever our politics are. That our politics are basically nothing compared, and borders mean nothing to viruses, just as our politics mean nothing to what will happen to the world if we don't start changing based on science. Alicia has to go, but she appreciates my work, and I'm glad we can agree to disagree here. Jennifer Doreen says here, we already read that. Okay, let's go down a little bit more. Rena Jensen says, the resources are available but not used correctly and sustainably. Yes, but that's changing. And we've seen that with this whole thing with coal. Remember how much, Donald Trump was claiming, 4 years ago when he was running for president in 2016, he said, I'm going to save the coal industry. Remember that? He went out there and all those coal miners and voted for him. And what happened? He didn't save them. He couldn't save them, because that was a dying industry. And, there is, in fact, 500 years worth of coal in the ground in the United States. Even at the levels that we're burning it at, you have 500 years of coal. So there were a number of plans to scrub the exhaust from coal when it burned coal, so that it would be clean. And that was before we understood how much carbon dioxide was raising the temperature. But even then, when you clean most of it, you have carbon dioxide, and the cost of it would quadruple the cost of electricity to scrub the air. So just based on the economics of it, the coal industry could not survive. And right now, as I said earlier, that we have at this point sustainable renewable energy. I don't know if you can hear that siren. It's 12 noon where I am. Renewable energy, 17.2% of electricity generated in the US is from renewable energy sources, 17.1% coal. 12 years ago, 50% was from coal. So it is changing. And the things that we thought could never be, that environmentalists believed, like even 10 years ago, that were impossible goals, are already happening now. and they're happening under capitalism. So the question is, can we make sure that the green energy is an energy of justice and not just something that's going to be for the rich? I think that's the thing that's going to be critically important. And one of the things that needs to be addressed by a new Congress, and this is what everything that I'm getting to here, the conclusion was that there has to be a new president of the United States. Joe Biden has to win. Democrats have to take over the White House, the Senate, and maintain their lead, if not increase it in the House, so that these sustainable things and these green energy policies can just begin. Because if we have 4 more years of Donald Trump reversing the clock on these environmental movements, it's not clear whether we'll be able to, whether the world will be able to survive that. And I think that's critically important. And that's why this title was Green Victory, perhaps. It's a green victory if there's a Democratic victory in November, because we don't have any green candidates who are going to be able to win at this point, realistically. And so okay, Mike M44, who's I think new, perhaps, says, why are we still in Afghanistan after 20 years? Both parties are blocking Trump from even drawing down the troops. Why? Because this is a banana republic owned by the military-industrial complex. Well, that's interesting. It was Dwight Eisenhower, the general who led, the victory in Europe, became president, who said that beware the military-industrial complex, that the connections between the military and industry were so powerful that they would, in fact, control the U.S. The United States spends more on its military. By the way, that banging in the background is our dog, a little poodle trying to get in here. So, the military, the U.S. spends on its military more than every other country in the world combined. Let me repeat that. The United States spends more on its military than every other country in the world combined. The U.S. spends more on its military than Russia, China, Germany, England, France, all those countries combined. At least the top 10, I know that for sure. The U.S. spends more than the top 10 other militaries combined. And I believe it's very close. If not, in fact, I've seen one quote that's saying the U.S. spends more on its military than every other country in the world combined spends on its military. Security is important, and this is an insecure world. And we see that now even with the cyber hacking by Russia and China and Iran, that I'm sure the U.S. does as well, so that security is important. But do we need to spend more than every other country in the world combined? Some of that money, if they talk about defunding the police, what about defunding the military? And that would go a long way to be able to fund the green stimulus. And the Green New Deal, in the research I've been doing since I became, a climate change reporter, more and more I see it as a climate crisis. And more I see the Green New Deal $16 trillion price tag as being the more realistic price tag of what needs to be done. So I get why Congress and Nicole Vance says, I get why the Congress and Senate won't change money. But why can't the people see the problem and vote the progressives and money out? Well, I think it's relatively simple. Or it isn't relatively simple. My explanation can be relatively simple. And number one, it's called Citizen United. And number two, it's called Rich People. If you go to trial and your jurors only hear one side, whether it's the prosecution or the defense, obviously that one side, almost in every case, is going to win. That's why with grand juries, there's an expression, they say a grand jury can indict a ham sandwich, because in a grand jury, you only hear the prosecution side. You don't hear anything from the defense. When you run for office in the United States now, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being one huge exception that I'm aware of, the biggest exception. So much depends on how much money you can raise, because you have to be able to buy ads on social media, ads on television, run a campaign with your campaign for campaign staff workers, and so on. And if you don't have that money, then your opponent will probably, especially if they're a Republican, will get that money from rich people who want the Republican Party to continue supporting the rich and capitalism, pure capitalism, not any socialism, and not any social programs either, if they could get it, or few social programs. So what happens is the rich people are able to support the campaigns of the people they want. And so those who run against them have an extremely difficult time, because it's hard to raise money, especially when people are struggling to survive, working 2 and 3 jobs. So that's the answer to it. Those with money are able to buy all the advertising and all the staff and all the campaign experts and stuff that are needed to win elections now. If you don't have money, some people had years ago talked to me about running for office. And a friend of mine who had worked for many years in politics in New York City said to me, okay, if anybody ever asks you to run for office, say to them, how much money are you going to raise for me? Because if you don't raise money, you're not going to win. So, and I'm no Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, so that's what it comes down to. The rich do buy both parties, that is true, but they clearly favor one party over the other. And at this point, the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement have changed things dramatically, almost overnight. You know, within a couple of months, they've moved this country forward in terms of climate justice and racial justice. And that momentum, I just read something that said the Black Lives Matter movement, after the killing of George Floyd, was the biggest movement in this country's history. 23 million people were involved. I don't know that that's accurate. I remember that for Earth Day in 1970, 20 million people were involved in that, and that was 1 out of 10 Americans. So I'm not sure that that's true, but if it is true, the point is it's definitely one of the biggest movements in American history. And so there is now momentum, and that momentum can be taken. So right now, you know, the progressives are a minority. They are growing in size. And if you include with the moderates or centrists, a plan that the centrists can accept, then, you know, Joe Biden will win. And at least you don't have somebody doing the negative, doing the anti-environment, you know, like Donald Trump is. In any case, it's Friday. I've been going on long enough. And Jennifer Doreen says, my husband was saying we give Biden 6 months after being in office, and if nothing is done, ... Well, this is very interesting. If Joe Biden wins, I think you will see the day after he's elected, there will be a rush of people beginning to criticize his green stimulus plan, which will be good, because that's what should be done. Because at least in his case, this is someone who will listen and try to do something, as opposed to a President Trump who will not listen and will try to do everything the opposite of the environmentalists and what climate needs. In any case, it's July 4th weekend. Wear a mask, social distance. Don't go to these big celebrations to spread the COVID-19 virus. And make sure that you stay well and be safe. Happy July 4th, and liberty and justice for all. I'm TY Chang. I believe that Jonathan will be here Monday at 11:30. You know, here at TYT, we keep on working. Have a great weekend.